He hadn't seen a woman in decades. Then 6 beautiful strangers knelt at his ranch. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. In the heart of the American West, there lived a man named Thomas. A rugged rancher, Thomas had lived alone for nearly 30 years. His ranch, nestled in a vast, lonely valley, was the last remnant of a life once full of laughter and family. The land stretched for miles, with rolling hills and endless skies that seemed to mock his solitude. After the loss of his wife and children to an illness many years ago, Thomas had retreated from the world, unwilling to face the pain of losing those he loved most. Day after day, he worked the land, tending to his cattle, but it was a hollow existence. The sound of the wind howling through the empty spaces around him was the only company he kept. He had once been a man full of life, known for his generous heart and welcoming nature. But now, he was a mere shell of the man he had been, consumed by grief and isolation. He had not seen a woman in years, and the thought of companionship was a distant memory, one he had long buried deep inside himself. But one morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, something changed. Thomas was out near the barn, checking on his cattle, when he heard the faint sound of footsteps in the dirt. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't until the figure appeared in the distance that he realized what was happening. 6 women, each more beautiful than the last, were walking toward him. They moved with purpose, their eyes set on him as if they had been searching for him all along. Thomas froze, unsure of what to do. He hadn't seen a woman in decades, and now, 6 were standing before him. His heart raced, his mind struggled to comprehend the reality of the situation. He stood there, speechless, watching as they approached. The women wore simple but elegant clothing, and their faces were a mix of determination and curiosity. As they reached the fence, they stopped and, without a word, knelt before him. Thomas was taken aback. What could they possibly want from him? Why had they come all the way out here, to this lonely ranch in the middle of nowhere? His mind raced with questions, but he could not find the answers. He had not prepared for this moment, this unexpected arrival. The women remained kneeling, their heads bowed in respect. For a long moment, the silence between them was deafening. Thomas could hear the thundering of his own heart in his chest as he stood there, unsure of what to do next. He had lived so long without human connection, without anyone to share his life with, that now, when it was suddenly thrust upon him, he didn't know how to react. As the minutes passed, Thomas found himself slowly walking toward them. His hands were shaking, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was different. These were not just strangers, they were women, beautiful, powerful, and mysterious. He had spent so many years avoiding contact with the outside world, convinced that he didn't deserve their kindness or their attention. Yet here they were, at his doorstep, offering him something he had long since stopped believing in: human connection. What did they want from him? Why had they come? His mind couldn't grasp the significance of this moment. They had knelt before him, waiting for him to make the next move. But what was he supposed to do? His life had been so solitary for so long that even the simplest interaction seemed foreign to him. It was then that one of the women, the leader, lifted her head and looked him straight in the eye. Her gaze was steady and filled with an intensity that Thomas had not seen in years. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through hardship, just as he had. "We've come for help," she said, her words calm but urgent. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Help?" he echoed, still trying to process what was happening. The woman nodded, her expression serious. "We have nowhere else to turn. You are the only one who can protect us now." For the first time in years, Thomas felt something stir within him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, his life could change, that he could still have a purpose beyond the endless work on the ranch. But little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would forever change the course of his life. A journey filled with danger, redemption, and the possibility of love, a love he never thought he would feel again. And it all started with 6 beautiful strangers who knelt before him, asking for his help. As Thomas stood there, still trying to process the sight of 6 women kneeling in front of him, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His life had been quiet for so long, and now, in an instant, everything was different. The silence between them stretched on, but Thomas didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure he had the right words. After what felt like an eternity, the woman in the front, the one who had spoken first, looked up at him again. Her eyes were steady, calm, and there was a resolve in them that Thomas couldn't ignore. "Please," she said, her voice low but filled with sincerity. "We need your help. There is nowhere else to go." Thomas swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat making it even harder to speak. He had spent years alone, avoiding the outside world, and now these strangers were asking for his help. He hadn't felt needed in such a long time. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. The woman took a deep breath, glancing at her companions before she met his eyes again. "Because you are the only one who can protect us. We've been running for days, and we are being hunted. They want us dead, and we have nowhere left to turn." Thomas stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't know what kind of trouble they were in, but he could see the fear in their eyes, especially in the one who had spoken. He couldn't stand the thought of anyone being hunted down, let alone these women who had shown up at his doorstep. He had lived too long in isolation, in a self-imposed exile, to ignore the call for help now. Despite his initial hesitation, he felt something stir within him, something that had been buried for years, a sense of duty, of responsibility. "All right," he said, his voice gruff. "I'll help, but you have to tell me more. Who's after you and why?" The woman nodded, her face serious. "It's a group of men from the next town over. They are led by a man named Walker. He's ruthless and has been hunting us for months. We're not just running from him. We're running from what he represents. He's looking for something, and we believe we have it." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard of Walker before. The man was a known outlaw, feared by many in the region. The thought of being involved with such a dangerous group sent a shiver through Thomas's bones, but he had already made his choice. He couldn't turn them away. Not now. "What is it that he's after?" Thomas asked. The woman hesitated, glancing at the other women for a moment before she spoke again. "We have knowledge. Knowledge of a hidden treasure, something that could change everything. Our ancestors hid it away to protect it, but now it's being sought by men who would do anything to find it. They will stop at nothing." Thomas didn't know what to think. A hidden treasure? It sounded like something out of a legend, but he could see the sincerity in their eyes. These women weren't making up a story, they were telling the truth. And Walker's men were coming after them because of it. "All right," Thomas said, his voice steady now, though his mind was racing. "You're safe here for now, but we need to make plans. We need to be ready when they come." The women nodded in unison, relief flooding their faces. Thomas had no idea what he was getting himself into, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just a man lost in his own grief anymore. He was a man who had the power to make a difference. As the women stood and dusted themselves off, Thomas led them into the house. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but one thing was certain. His life was about to change. The quiet, lonely ranch he had called home for so long was now a place of refuge, a place where danger was on the horizon. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't facing it alone. Thomas stood by the window, gazing out at the horizon, his mind racing. The women had been with him for nearly a week now, and in that short time, his life had already begun to change. They had made themselves at home in the ranch, helping with the chores, cooking meals, and even tending to the animals. But despite their presence, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in on them. He had heard rumors of Walker's men getting closer, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they would come for the women. It wasn't just the treasure they sought. It was the knowledge, the power that these women held. And he couldn't let that fall into the wrong hands. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land, Thomas felt a strange sense of determination rise within him. He was no longer the lonely rancher, hiding from the world. He had a purpose now, a reason to fight. And fight he would. He turned to the women, who were sitting around the fireplace, talking quietly. "We need to prepare," Thomas said, his voice firm. The women looked up at him, their faces a mixture of relief and concern. They knew what he meant. The time for hiding was over. Tomorrow, We'll begin fortifying the ranch, Thomas continued. We'll set up traps, reinforce the fences, and make sure we're ready for whatever comes. The woman who had first spoken to him, the leader of the group, stood up. Her name was Maria, and her eyes were filled with gratitude. Thank you, Thomas, she said softly. We knew you would help us, but we didn't expect you to risk your life for us. Thomas shook his head. You don't have to thank me. I've spent too many years hiding from my past, from the world. I don't want to do that anymore. He paused, looking out the window again. I've spent too long in the shadows, and I'm not going back. The other women nodded, their expressions serious. They could see the change in him, the fire that had been reignited. We'll fight together, Maria said, her voice strong. We've faced death before. We're not afraid of what's coming. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Thomas felt something stir inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of belonging, a sense of family, and he would protect it with everything he had. The next day, they worked tirelessly to prepare for the coming battle. They dug trenches, reinforced the barn doors, and set traps around the perimeter of the property. Thomas showed the women how to use the rifles, and though they were hesitant at first, they quickly became proficient. As the sun began to set again, Thomas stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out at the land he had called home for so many years. But now, it felt different. It felt like his home was no longer just a place of isolation. It was a place of hope, of strength, and he would fight to keep it. As the night fell, Thomas gathered the women around the fire. They were exhausted, but there was a sense of peace in the air, a sense of unity. Tomorrow, we fight, Thomas said, his voice low but resolute. But tonight, we rest. The women nodded, grateful for the quiet moment. And as the flames of the fire flickered in the dark, Thomas knew that whatever happened the next day, he had done everything he could to protect the ones he now called family. The danger was real, and Walker's men would come for them. But Thomas was no longer afraid. He had found something worth fighting for, and that made all the difference. The night passed quietly, but Thomas could feel the tension in the air. He lay awake in his bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, his thoughts racing. Tomorrow would be the day they had been preparing for, the day they would face Walker and his men. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew one thing. They were ready. The women had proven themselves capable, and they had built a bond with him that was stronger than any he had ever felt. As dawn broke, casting a soft glow over the ranch, Thomas rose from his bed and walked outside. The cool morning air hit him like a wave. But it didn't faze him. He had been through worse. He had seen the worst of life, and yet, here he was, standing tall. The women were already up, gathering their things, preparing for the battle that lay ahead. Maria, the woman who had first spoken to him, approached him with a determined look in her eyes. Are you ready? She asked, her voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. Thomas nodded, his jaw set. I am, he said. He had made peace with the reality of what was to come. He had made peace with the fact that his life had changed forever. No longer was he the lonely rancher hiding from the world. Now, he was a protector, a man with a purpose. Maria gave him a small smile before turning back to the others. They had worked hard to prepare, and now it was time to put everything into action. The ranch was fortified, the traps set, and the rifles ready. They had done everything they could to ensure their survival. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the sound of hooves reached Thomas's ears. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. It was time. Walker's men were here. The women gathered around him, standing shoulder to shoulder, ready for what was to come. Stay calm, Thomas said, his voice steady. We've got this. As the first rider appeared on the horizon, Thomas's heart began to race. It wasn't just the sight of the approaching riders. It was the realization that this was it. This was the moment he had been dreading and preparing for. The group of men, led by Walker, rode toward the ranch with the kind of confidence that comes from years of intimidation and violence. But Thomas wasn't intimidated. He had spent too long hiding from the world. Now, he was ready to face it head-on. As the riders approached, Thomas stood tall, his rifle in hand, ready to defend what he had come to care for. Maria and the other women stood beside him, their expressions grim but determined. They knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about survival. It was about something much bigger. It was about taking back control of their lives and fighting for what they believed in. As Walker and his men dismounted, they looked around, sizing up the situation. Walker, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "You've got some nerve, hiding out here, Thomas," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "You've made a mistake." Thomas's grip on the rifle tightened, but he kept his composure. "I don't think it's a mistake," he said, his voice steady. "You're the one who's made a mistake by coming here." Walker's eyes narrowed. "You're in over your head. You think you can protect these women? They're mine now, and I'm not leaving without what's mine." The tension between them was palpable. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. But Thomas wasn't about to back down. "They're not yours," he said, his voice firm. "And they're not going anywhere." Walker laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You really think you can stand against me?" he sneered. "You and your little band of women don't stand a chance." But Thomas wasn't backing down. He had already made his choice. And no matter what Walker said, he wasn't going to let him take the women. "We'll see about that," Thomas said, his voice low and determined. As he spoke, the women around him raised their rifles, their faces set in grim determination. Walker's men exchanged uncertain glances, but they were too proud to back down. The tension reached its breaking point. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence of the morning. The battle had begun, but Thomas wasn't afraid. He had something to fight for now. He had found a reason to live, and he wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, and the air was filled with the smell of smoke and the sound of footsteps running across the dirt. Thomas knew that this battle would determine everything. But no matter the outcome, he had made his stand. He wasn't just a man hiding in the shadows anymore. He was a man with a purpose, and he would protect what was his. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, the air thick with tension and the acrid smell of smoke. Thomas stood tall, his heart racing, but his hands steady on the rifle. The women beside him, their faces grim but resolute, had already proven themselves in this fight. They were no longer just refugees, they were warriors in their own right. The first few shots came quickly, but they were met with equal resistance. Walker's men weren't the only ones with guns, and the ranch had been fortified with traps and barriers to slow their advance. The women moved with purpose, covering one another, taking positions behind rocks and fences as they returned fire. The men who had once seemed so intimidating now appeared unsure, their confidence waning as they realized the ranch wasn't the easy target they had expected. Thomas's mind raced as he calculated their next move. The sound of footsteps in the dirt told him that Walker himself was approaching. He could see the man's silhouette, standing tall with his men gathered behind him. Walker's face was twisted with anger, his hands resting on the handles of his pistols. "You really think you can stop me?" Walker shouted, his voice carrying across the field. Thomas didn't flinch. "I've already stopped you once," he called back, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "You're not going to take what's mine." Walker's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, with a quick motion, he pulled his pistol and fired a shot toward Thomas. The bullet zipped past him, the wind of it making him flinch, but he didn't move. He had been in worse situations before. He wasn't about to let fear take control now. The next few moments were a blur of gunfire and movement. Thomas fired back, his shot finding its mark in one of Walker's men. The man fell to the ground, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in the group. The others hesitated, but Walker pushed them forward. "Don't back down," he yelled. "We've come too far." But Thomas could see it in their eyes. They were beginning to doubt. The women were holding their ground, their faces set with determination. Maria, the woman who had led them here, moved quickly between cover, her rifle aimed with precision. She took down one of the men who had been trying to flank their position. Thomas's heart swelled with pride. These women weren't just hiding. They were fighting for their survival, and they were doing it with everything they had. As the minutes dragged on, it became clear that Walker's men were not prepared for a battle like this. They had expected an easy victory, a quick raid, but they had underestimated the resolve of the people they had come to steal from. Slowly, the tide began to turn. One by one, Walker's men were forced to retreat, either wounded or too afraid to continue the fight. But Walker wasn't done. He was still standing, still shouting orders to his men, but even his voice seemed to falter. "This isn't over, Thomas," he shouted, his eyes burning with fury. Thomas steadied his rifle, taking careful aim. He didn't respond. There was no need for words now. His actions had already spoken for him. With a single shot, Thomas took down Walker's last remaining ally, and the field went quiet. Walker was alone now, surrounded by the ranchers and women who had once been so vulnerable, so helpless. He was the one who was outnumbered, the one who was now on the losing side. The silence was deafening. Walker stood there, his hand still on his pistol, his chest heaving with anger and disbelief. Thomas lowered his rifle slowly, his gaze never leaving the other man. "It's over," Thomas said quietly. Walker's eyes burned with fury, but there was a flicker of something else too, defeat. He glanced around at his fallen men, at the women who had been so determined, so fierce in their defense of their home. And for the first time, he seemed to understand that there was nothing left to fight for. "You've lost," Thomas added, his voice firm. Walker didn't speak again. He turned and began to walk away, his pride the only thing left to him. The ranchers and the women watched him go, their breathing slow, their bodies tense, but their eyes were filled with something new, relief. The battle was over, and they had won. As the dust settled and the sound of the final gunshot faded into the distance, Thomas allowed himself a deep breath. He looked around at the women, at the land that had once felt so empty, so lonely. But now, it felt like home again. The danger had passed. They had fought, and they had survived. They had come together to protect what was theirs. And for the first time in many years, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for him after all. The dust settled slowly as Walker and his remaining men retreated, leaving behind a battlefield that felt both victorious and tragic. Thomas stood still, his rifle still in hand, his mind still processing the chaos that had unfolded. The adrenaline from the fight had begun to fade, but the weight of what they had just endured remained. His eyes scanned the ranch, taking in the women who had stood by him, fought by his side. They were all breathing heavily, but there was a quiet sense of pride in their movements now. They had done it. They had won. Maria, the woman who had become his closest ally, approached him. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes were clear and strong. "We did it," she said, her voice steady despite the intensity of the moment. Thomas nodded, still in a daze. "We did," he replied, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The ranch that had been nothing more than a place of isolation for so many years had become something more. It had become a sanctuary, a place of protection, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas realized that he wasn't alone anymore. The women had come to him in need, but in the end, they had given him something in return, a purpose. And that was something he hadn't had in decades. As the morning sun climbed higher, Thomas took a deep breath, letting the reality of their victory sink in. They had fought for their lives, for their home, and they had prevailed. But there was still work to be done. The ranch had been damaged in the fight, and while the danger had passed for now, Thomas knew that they couldn't let their guard down. "We need to repair the fences and check the traps," he said, his voice firm, though there was a hint of relief in it now. "We can't afford to be caught off guard again." Maria nodded, already turning to gather the other women. "We'll get to work right away," she said, her tone practical as always. The rest of the women began to move, their exhaustion from the battle evident, but their determination unbroken. They had survived, and now it was time to rebuild. As Thomas watched them work, he realized something important. They had not only protected each other from the outside world, but they had also helped him find himself again. He wasn't just the rancher who had lived alone for so many years. He was part of something now, something bigger than just himself. He was part of a family forged in the heat of battle, in the struggle to survive. That evening, as the sun began to set, Thomas stood on the porch of his house, looking out over the land. The work had begun, and though it was far from over, he could see the changes already taking place. The women were laughing, talking as they worked, their voices filling the silence that had once been so oppressive. They were no longer just survivors. They were builders, shaping a new life together. Maria joined him on the porch, her steps light despite the long day. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice gentle but probing. Thomas turned to look at her, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "This place, it's more than just a ranch. It's a home. It's our home now." Maria's smile was small but warm. Yes, it is. She paused for a moment, looking out at the land with him. And we'll make sure it stays that way. Thomas nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of pride and gratitude. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. They had fought for their survival, but now, they were fighting for something more, a future. Together, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas took a deep breath and watched the last of the light fade. The night was still and quiet, but there was a new sense of peace settling over the ranch. The battle was over, but the real work had just begun. And this time, he wasn't alone. The days that followed the battle felt like a blur of hard work and constant motion. Thomas and the women worked tirelessly to rebuild the ranch. They repaired fences, strengthened the barn, and made sure the land was secure. The tension from the fights still lingered in the air, but as the weeks went on, the ranch began to feel like a true home again. The morning sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the valley. The land had begun to heal, and so had they. The battle had been hard, but it had forged a bond between them, one that could never be broken. Thomas found himself working alongside the women more often now, his once lonely existence now filled with the sound of their laughter, their voices carrying across the fields as they tended to their chores. They had built something together, something strong. Maria, who had led them through the hardest moments, stood beside him more and more as the days went by. Their partnership had grown, from necessity to something deeper. But it wasn't just Maria. Each of the women had brought something to the table, their own strengths and talents coming together to create a unity Thomas hadn't realized he needed. The ranch was thriving, and with it, his hope for a future that had once seemed impossible. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Thomas stood outside, looking out over the land that had become so much more than just a piece of property. It was a place of healing, of renewal. It was their place now, and he knew they would protect it with everything they had. Maria approached him quietly, her footsteps soft against the earth. She stood beside him, her gaze following his as they both looked out at the ranch. "It's different now," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the truth. Thomas nodded, his hand resting on the fence. "It is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It feels like we've earned it, like we've built something real." Maria smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "We have," she agreed. There was a pause between them, a quiet understanding that passed between them without the need for words. The silence was comfortable, filled with the bond they had forged through struggle and shared purpose. But as they stood there, something else began to stir within Thomas. A sense of responsibility that went beyond just the ranch, beyond just the women who had come to him for help. He realized, for the first time, that he had a duty to protect not just his home, but the future they had built. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "But there's still work to be done." Maria turned to him, her expression serious. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Thomas said slowly, "there's a bigger world out there. One we can't ignore forever. Walker and his men were just the beginning. We can't live in hiding." Maria studied him for a moment, her gaze intense. "You're right. But we can't fight every battle. We've done enough to protect what's ours." "I know," Thomas replied, "but there's something more. I've been thinking about it for a while. We need to make sure that what we've built here, the life we've created, doesn't just stay in this valley. It needs to grow. It needs to reach others who need help, who need a place like this. We need to make sure the world knows that we're not just a part of the past. We're part of something bigger." Maria's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already given so much, Thomas. You've protected us. But we need you here, with us. We need your strength, your heart." Thomas met her gaze, his heart swelling with the weight of her words. She was right. He had given so much, and it had already changed everything. But he knew, deep down, that the journey they had started wasn't over. It was just the beginning. "We'll do it together," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We'll make sure that what we've built doesn't just survive. It thrives." As the last light of day faded and the stars began to fill the sky, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, tangible hope. And with that hope, he knew there was nothing they couldn't do. The battle was over, but the fight for their future had just begun. Weeks passed since Thomas and the women made the decision to take their lives beyond the ranch. The work on the land continued, but there was an undeniable sense of anticipation in the air. The small, self-sustaining world they had built was no longer enough. The realization had settled in for Thomas. They had created something strong here, but it needed to expand. They needed to reach out to others who had nowhere to turn, who had been abandoned or hunted, just as they had been. The fear that had once gripped Thomas was no longer there. He had faced down Walker and his men, and he had proven that he wasn't afraid to fight for what was right. But this new venture, this step beyond the ranch, required something different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building something that could last, something that could help others. One late afternoon, as the orange glow of the setting sun painted the sky, Thomas stood at the edge of the property, looking out at the vast land before him. Maria joined him, her steps light against the dirt. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice filled with concern. Thomas turned to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his thoughts. "About what's next. About what we're really building here." Maria's expression softened. "We've built a home, a family. What else do you need?" Thomas paused, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "We need to take this further. We can't keep living in this valley, isolated. We need to make sure that the people who need help, who need protection, know that there's a place for them here." Maria's eyes shone with understanding. "You want to build something more than just a safe place. You want to create a refuge for those who have nowhere to go." Thomas nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. "Exactly. We've fought for this land, for each other. But it's time to fight for something bigger. It's time to build something that will last, something that will be a sanctuary for others, just like it's been for us." Maria stood quietly for a moment, considering his words. Then, she placed her hand on his arm, offering her unwavering support. "We can do it," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "We've already done the impossible. What's next is just another step forward." The weeks that followed were filled with planning and preparation. Thomas and Maria, along with the women who had become more than just allies, they were family, began laying the groundwork for their new mission. Word spread quickly about the safe haven they were creating, and soon, people began arriving at the ranch. Some came on foot, others by horseback, all looking for shelter, for safety, for a place to call their own. They came from all walks of life, refugees, outcasts, survivors of countless hardships. And one by one, they were welcomed. The ranch that had once been a lonely outpost in the wilderness became a thriving community, a sanctuary for those in need. It wasn't easy. There were days when Thomas questioned whether they were doing the right thing, when the weight of responsibility seemed too much to bear. But then he would look around at the people they had brought together, at Maria, at the women who had fought beside him, at the families who had found refuge, and he knew they were on the right path. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about living, truly living. And that was something worth fighting for. As the months went by, the ranch flourished. The fences were stronger, the crops more abundant, the homes built with care. They had built something from nothing, and it was growing every day. But there was still work to be done. The world beyond the ranch was still a dangerous place, and Thomas knew they couldn't protect everyone. But they could protect the ones who came to them. They could offer a safe haven, a place where people could heal and rebuild. And that was enough. One cold evening, as Thomas sat by the fire, surrounded by the people he had come to care for, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had made it. And for the first time in years, Thomas knew that the future was bright. He wasn't just a man who had survived. He was a man who had built something worth living for. And he was ready for whatever came next. As the seasons passed, the ranch continued to grow and evolve. What had once been a lonely, quiet place now thrived with life and purpose. The families that had found refuge on the land were no longer strangers. They were a community, bound together by their shared experiences, their struggles, and their triumphs. For Thomas, this was the life he had always dreamed of but never thought possible. The quiet mornings now greeted him with the sound of laughter, the clatter of hooves, and the bustling of people working together. Maria, who had stood by him from the very beginning, had become his closest confidant. The bond they shared had deepened over time, but it wasn't just the bond between them that had grown. The ranch had become a symbol of resilience, of rebuilding what was lost, and of giving hope to those who had nowhere else to turn. One day, as Thomas stood outside, watching the sun sink below the horizon, Maria joined him. They had both seen how far they had come, and yet, there was a quiet understanding that their work wasn't done. The community they had built was strong, but it needed to be protected, nurtured, and expanded. "Do you ever wonder how it all happened?" Maria asked, her voice soft but filled with a question they both had been asking themselves. Thomas turned to look at her, a small smile on his face. "All the time," he replied. "I never imagined we'd be here. I never thought I'd see this place become what it is now." Maria smiled, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "And yet here we are." They stood in silence for a while, taking in the view of the ranch, once a barren stretch of land, now full of life and promise. The barn, the fields, the houses, they were all signs of what had been built, of the future that had been created. "I think we've done something important," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've given people a chance, a place to start over, a place to call home." Maria nodded, her gaze turning to the people working in the fields, the children playing nearby. "And they've given us something, too. They've given us a family." Thomas placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of the years they had spent together, the hardships they had endured. It wasn't just the ranch that had changed. It was them. The lonely man who had once hidden from the world had become part of something greater. And now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas knew that he had finally found his place in the world. The future stretched out before him, full of possibilities. There was still work to do, but for the first time in years, he was no longer alone. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all. The community they had built was a testament to their strength, to their ability to survive and thrive in the face of adversity. But it was also a testament to something more, a belief in the power of connection, of unity, and of the shared bond that came from fighting for something greater than themselves. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Thomas and Maria stood side by side, watching over the ranch they had fought so hard to protect. They had built something that would last, something that would continue to grow, and something that would be a beacon of hope for others in need. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt at peace. He had found his purpose. He had found his family. And as the night settled in around them, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Thomas believed that the future was bright, and he was ready for it.